Okay, so we've defined the modernized state. We've dug a little bit deeper into what our clients' needs and outcomes are. We've talked and zoomed in on mainframe modernization. So now let's maybe go a little bit deeper into what the service provider ecosystem kind of looks like. Brent, I think I want to go to you first on this, and then we'll pop over to Imran. But how should GSIs like NTT Data realign to the market so we can really be seen as that strategic partner rather than a sort of tech provider only?
I think there's two aspects to this. One is, building the expertise and the ecosystem so that your customers trust that you can get the job done. But I think it's also making sure that you are not addressing the customer like in the weeds, in the technology. You're really talking about the business outcomes. You're keeping it at the business strategy and decision level, because ultimately I think the goal is that you end up with a combined business and technology system, not one where the business and the technology sits separately. And so I think like GSIs need to model that in the way they go to market as well, and be able to address the business issues and then be able to drill down later with that partner ecosystem, that expertise into, delivering on the technology outcomes to drive business strategy.
Absolutely. Honestly, I think that dovetails nicely into, sort of a recognized domain level expertise that we find is necessary to drive those kind of strategic long-term partnerships. Mm-hmm. When you're talking to, let's just take, for example, the financial services industry, you can't really come to them with a horizontal approach on either a modernization journey or a portfolio strategy vision. You really have to tailor your approach to the client, to the environment, to the industry, to the sector that you're specifically dealing with. And that's a lot of what we've been focused on at NTT, is sort of lifting, our domain expertise out of these delivery units and bringing them to the offering, bringing them to our go-to-market so that we can really demonstrate the depth of our capabilities within a particular domain or service area. So I think that really strengthens the factor that you mentioned. Can you deliver this? Do you have the specific expertise pertinent to understand the business rules relevant to our specific industry? So that really gives us more credibility in the service delivery aspect of things. Yeah. So I think that's one big thing that we've been focused on. And then another big thing that we've been focused on is, NTT Data, and maybe this is a little bit of a unique challenge for us, but we mean different things to different clients. Some of our clients know us for being able to deliver this total transformation journey. Some of us know that we have really good skill set in application development, and so we can be a body shop for particular services or products they're trying to get off the floor. So we have this sort of diverse set of capabilities, and we're not all things to all people. And so we really are trying to emphasize, our industry consulting experience, our portfolio strategy capabilities, especially with our value stream management approach, to help our clients understand that, not only can we build a strategy, not only can we ideate with you, but then we can also follow through on delivery, implementation, and ultimately transition and handover. Because, something we really peripherally talked about earlier is how do you actually transition an environment successfully to a client that you've already built and implemented? Well, it turns out that there's a lot of hand-holding in that process. You need to have blended transition teams. You need to be thinking about workforce transformation before the end of a contract. You need to be talking about cultural buy-in from a portfolio leadership level. So all of those things are factors that can ultimately define the success of strategic partnerships with your clients.
Right. Yeah, I think a couple of things you said both of you said really triggered for me. I think for GSI needs to be really committed to the outcome with a client, and not just the project, not just the service, but the total outcome and the total journey to that outcome, right? And I think that's, when we engage with clients, we're really talking about taking on that level of that level of relationship, that level of partnership, and working toward those. But also, I think, Jesse, you mentioned GSIs as an ecosystem, and I think that's a really interesting point of view for us to take, because part of the value proposition for a GSI is, we can be all things to all people. We can come in and sort of be, one-stop shopping and take care of everything. And what we've done more and more, I think, over the last few years is to really consider ourselves as a true integrator, right? As part of a larger ecosystem, and to begin to pull together partnerships. We've always partnered for sure, and some of that partnership activity has been, for a particular client or for a particular outcome. But the idea that we would begin to proactively partner for stronger solutions, really to come to clients and be able to say, look, the whole is really greater than the sum of its parts, is a big difference for us. And I think that's something that we feel strongly is important to our clients. We feel strongly it's in their best interest as well, and we're doing a lot more work in that area.
I'm reminded of some of Forrester's research, in fact, around there's these core drivers, platforms, partnerships, and practices that are really helping build a future fit tech strategy for our clients. And so thinking about those partners, how are we kind of reaching out into the market and picking up the pieces that we need to help and manage all of that to help drive that future fit tech strategy for our clients?
Yeah, there's, you can sort of slice that in a number of different ways, right? There are, people, process, technology. How are we driving sort of best of breed integration of that is part of it. From a partner ecosystem standpoint, your modernization solutions in specific are most certainly going to involve some sort of platform with the hyperscalers. Yeah. So having a proactive partnership with hyperscalers is I think to some degree table stakes. But looking at how that is not just related to the platform, but also what are the tools that are being brought to bear? What's the software that's being used? Is there a platform? We talked a little bit earlier about management platforms at the portfolio level. So are we really driving that comprehensively, and are we successfully leading with consulting? Because when we talk about a partner ecosystem, those all have to come to bear. We have to have a consultative viewpoint for our clients. We have to have an industry-specific viewpoint, and then we have to bring all of the rest of the benefits of the platform, the target platform, the technology stack, and the tools.
Do you mind if I just bring up something else real quick? Just as a little bit of a tangent, we also have some research around the trust imperative and the importance of trust between, even B2B customers. It's not just B2C. And anyone that engages with a GSI or an NTT Data is looking at a multi-year engagement probably. Yes. So managing that trust ends up being really important. What do you guys do, especially when you're talking about managing an ecosystem of other providers that are helping you with specific capabilities, to make sure that you are managing the trust of your customers responsibly?
Yeah, so I know one thing that we have specifically is a form of quality review board, and essentially that identifies any, maybe red or yellow type projects, why are they off track, what are we not doing right. So we have frequent client touch points. We try to ensure consistency in teaming. Obviously that can be tough with the labor market as it is, but those are a few of the key quality drivers that we look towards to ensure that trust is maintained, that we're really establishing client partnerships, that we're working towards shared business outcomes. So those are a few of the process elements that we use to sort of enhance our quality drivers that we at NTT have pretty well established frameworks around.
Mm-hmm. There's a cultural standard for us, right? So we think of it, we call it sometimes the way of life, but it's, I think the key piece for our client engagements, for how we work with each other internally, is radical transparency. So we, as a cultural sort of imperative, radical transparency with our clients is how we maintain trust. Now, building trust with a new client, right? There's a little bit of it takes time, right? You have to really get in there. A lot of the mechanics of it, governance, communication plans, all that standard kind of activity happens. For the best engagements where there's an original alignment around business outcomes, when there's a shared understanding of what we're doing and why we're doing it, what's the big picture, that really, really is a critical accelerator to building trust. But ultimately, what we find is that radical transparency is the critical factor, and the exercise over time of being able to share in business. I'll bring us back to business resiliency. When we can share that with our clients, where we can actively work with them to adapt to a disruption. I mean, we saw that. We have such great examples of how that played out with the pandemic, and we helped our clients to be able to transition to completely remote activity. We helped keep their business alive. We helped them really begin to transform to meet the needs of a different kind of business paradigm. That shared experience and that shared adaptiveness is really, really important to accelerating trust.
Honestly, one additional factor I just came to mind is also a really well-balanced shoring model, right? You know, if you're working with, let's just take, for example, a US-based organization, and they're really trying to understand, you know, what kinds of modernization imperatives make the most sense for them to implement over a short and long term. And you know, if you immediately start outsourcing all of the development, upfront portfolio consulting to, you know, low-cost offshore markets, and you know, sometimes you might struggle with communication challenges, with process inefficiencies, with time zone differences. So really establishing like well-balanced shoring models can be a framework for success in establishing trust, especially with new clients who might not be familiar with your offshore capabilities, so they want to make sure that everything's being handled with the right amount of customer intimacy. So that is another thing that we do at NTT. You know, we have a blend of delivery centers that are, you know, either on or co-located or regionally located or globally oriented. So we have a blend of delivery centers across the world that really enable us to do everything from design, development, and implementation, depending on what makes sense to the particular client and engagement at hand.
And I'll go a little further, because we were talking about the ecosystem, right? That level of trust is critical to a long-term relationship between a GSI and a client, for sure. And it's also really, really critical for a partner ecosystem. So if we're going to if we're going to create partnerships proactively and bring those partnered solutions to our clients, those partnerships have to have that same radical transparency and trust, or they don't work as well as they never become greater than the sum of the parts.
Right. It makes me think about how important it is, this radical transparency, how important it is to educate our clients on the front end on how this should go and how we're going to be their hand-holding, like you mentioned. And Ron, you've mentioned that too, Brent. How is NTT Data educating their clients? When does that happen in the partnership? Where are those conversations happening? And how do we, that education has to be part of building trust. How do we do that?
I think there's a span, right? So there's a little bit of continuous. We've talked about continuous modernization. There's a continuous trust experience, right, that happens in a relationship like that. But I think the key thing is, you know, as we establish the relationship, as we build the relationship, we execute in that way. I think the critical positioning for, at least for NTT Data as a GSI, is that we are a long-term partner. We're not going to, we don't talk about just executing the project and leaving. We talk about what's the outcome, what's the next project, what's the next program that we can run. And once we've delivered for clients, how do we continue to stay involved for support, for the level of support that a particular client requires or that they've decided is optimal? How do we stick around and help sort of that journey enter into the modernized state and stay continuous?
And honestly, as part of that transparency, one way that you can really prove your transparency is by maintaining impartiality towards tooling and solutions and being a vendor agnostic service provider, right? I mean, obviously a lot of service providers invest in their own IP and their own tooling and their own frameworks and their own process. But on top of that, you really have to be able to distinguish and determine which cloud service provider makes the most sense for a particular situation, which SaaS platform makes sense to implement in a particular environment. You know, those kind of questions come to bear. And if you demonstrate a willingness to lean on a particular hyperscaler or a particular SaaS provider, that might limit the trust that a client has for you, or, you know, sort of create a potential for bias in a situation that could ultimately play in a loss of trust. So really balancing that vendor agnosticism with our own IP and platform approach is a key for a service provider like NTT.
And it's you balance that, right? It's transparency, as you said, right? So, if we didn't believe that our IP, that our solution, whether it's the Nucleus platform, right, UniKix rehosting, if we didn't believe that was the best solution for clients, we wouldn't take it to them, right? We'd have a discussion, and if we do believe it, and we do in many cases, believe me, we'll tell clients exactly why. We think this is what you're going to get of it. We think this is important to you. We think this is why this is such a great fit. And we'll help you do your due diligence around that.
We called it toxic technical debt earlier, Brent. So let's maybe come back to that a bit. How does one avoid incurring that toxic technical debt? What are the critical success factors for those large-scale modernization partnerships like we're talking about having? What we're leading to here is how do we prove that? What does it look? What does the value measure look like? So what are those critical success factors for large-scale modernization, and how do we avoid toxic technical debt?
I mean, I think that one of the big success factors is, one, the honesty and transparency. Like, people need to be able to see their environment the way it is and be able to see the opportunities they're missing based on the technical debt that they have acquired over time. But ultimately, it's a business decision whether they invest to retire that debt. And it needs to be a business decision. I think, like, a GSI or partner, like, their position there is to highlight the problem, show what the future state might look like, show an incremental way to get there, because, I don't think, like, the old, we're going to completely transform and we'll deliver the new solution in a year model really ever worked, right? Like, everyone got to that year point and, like, this is not what I thought I was going to get. So, like, doing this incremental model where you're iterating over time and building that into how you deal with technology services from top to bottom ends up being really important. So you end up having a backlog. We talked about a modernization backlog earlier, but it's not quite the same as what I refer to as toxic technical debt. You can manage a backlog. You may not have the resources to address, a priority 2 project right now, so you're only dealing with priority 1 projects. But as long as you keep looking at that backlog and pushing things up in the queue, that ends up being really important. And that's a place where, like, a good trusted partner can help a business develop that queue and help them kind of figure out what the priority is, what things really have to happen first. And I think, though, what things have to happen first is a really big question, because a lot of people want the end product first, and they're not going to get it. Right. So you have to figure out, okay, how do I build in a project that has incremental wins, moves us towards the end state, and is constantly getting us closer to being at that end state, so that, like, the customer feels value being generated. They're not abandoning the project in the middle.
Right. It's a productive interim state almost.
And the transparency piece is that, like, if there's a hiccup, you want your customer to know that you're being honest with them, because everyone knows when they're being lied to, right? They may not know exactly what the lie is, but they know when they're being lied to. Absolutely. And that's the point where they start looking, for other services to take over the project from you. And that's when modernization stops for a lot of businesses. They hit a roadblock because there was a point where there was a hiccup and they didn't feel they could trust their vendor anymore. And so they, stopped.
Guaranteed, in a large-scale modernization program, the client is going to have to, whatever belief happened at the outset of that program is going to change. There will need to be some sort of adaptation to what happens. The client will have to adapt, the GSI will have to adapt, and if they don't adapt together, if it's not mutual, if it's not open and transparent, then it falls apart. We've seen that before. I think you're quite right.
Yeah.
I think one topic that relates pretty strongly to, progressive technical debt and, how to handle it is this concept of portfolio creep, right? Over time, portfolios on average have the tendency to become more complex rather than less complex. Mm-hmm. You're picking up services, you're building new applications, you're integrating across new frameworks, you might be, adopting new SaaS platforms. And honestly, I see a couple of anti-patterns considering portfolio creep. One is the concept that if we go back to our persona discussion and, you have this purchase authority flowing down to business unit leaders, which means there's less centralization around IT spend, which means it's harder to achieve a portfolio level view around the IT modernization journey. So that could create more fragmented, more disparate systems, more disparate approaches to deployment, integration, development. And then on the flip side of that, you see this movement towards mesh fabrics, towards API-ifying everything, towards hyperconvergence, towards automation. So I see those as push factors towards portfolio simplification. So to me, I sort of see these two patterns playing in opposite directions in the market, and ultimately having different impacts on technical debt. But generally speaking, I would say that I think the push factors are winning, and on average, portfolio complexity is increasing, which only emphasizes the need to handle technical debt because it's probably popping up in places that you're not even got your eyes on. So
I think that's a really important point, right? The technical debt, to your point, Brent, technical debt can be managed. Right? Zero technical debt is not a realistic goal, but well-managed technical debt is a reasonable goal. But you can only manage it if you can see it. And as your portfolio becomes more complicated, if you don't expose that technical debt, people don't know what's happening, then it really can become destructive. When we talk about how we apply our Nucleus platform, for instance, we're really trying to capture places where technical debt is existing in the portfolio and not really obvious. And so I think that's a critical piece for sort of governing that technical debt and keeping it out. When we talk about a modernization program itself, it's a little bit more insidious because a lot of times it's very difficult for clients to not modernize their technical debt and just take it with them. And so we really work hard when we do our discovery, when we work on using the Application Transformation Suite to understand what the value is in an application. The intent is to identify what technical debt can be best left behind. And so I think modernization programs have to think about technical debt a little bit differently.
To one of the points that you were talking about, Imran, around portfolio creep, I think that is also a vestige of that feeling like we only have one shot at this project. We have to get it all in. And I think decomposing that mindset and that myth is also really important. I think using the value stream management approach ends up being important here, kind of in line, in concert with adopting DevOps methodologies.
Right.
This idea that you can deal with things in little chunks at a time as long as you're aligning it to the overall value of the project or the portfolio. And I think having that regular realignment, both on the business side and the technology side, is a function that enterprises really need to learn how to do. And hopefully that's something that the GSIs out there are teaching their clients how to do, because the reality is that you're not going to have a consistently modern tech stack or tech delivery unless you're constantly looking at it and getting the things out of the environment that no longer have value and adding things to the environment that add value.
I think something that ties nicely into what we do as service providers to facilitate that process. And I think this is something that just about every service provider is doing in terms of teaming, is really emphasizing the need for cross-functional teaming, because that gives you the true cohesion between business advocacy and technology advocacy, right? If you just have technologists working on a problem, you're going to get a very different solution versus if you just have business professionals ideating on what their desired end state is going to be. And so how do you rectify and remediate across that bridge is you really have to have consistency in teaming and also a blended approach to teaming. And I know that for our application development and modernization services, that's something that we've been pivoting a lot of our contracts towards, moving towards this team-based, pod-based model for delivering those kinds of services to ensure coherence across both business and technology verticals.
We've talked, there's a lot of positive approaches coming out of this right now. I don't mean to put you guys on the spot, my own team, but I'm going to. I feel like the audience might really care about an example of this? Like, can we tell a story anonymously that shows how NTT Data has helped a client in this way?
The first thought that comes to mind, I've been pretty heavily involved in some of our healthcare provider modernization schemes, and really updating our frameworks on delivering healthcare provider modernization. And so one thing we've noticed is that there's a couple really big aspects of that business that are critically underserved. And one of them is data interoperability, and another is claims processing. Right, so when you think about that on a topical level, you're thinking, okay, I'm going to need probably some SMEs from the insurance and claims processing side. I'm going to need some SMEs on the data engineering side, and then I'm going to need a spattering of developers who understand modern frameworks, who understand ERM systems, CRM systems, EHR, EMR systems. So you could see that the level of expertise is broadly required. And in the past, it was a bit segmented and isolated in terms of the teams that we used to deliver that group of services. So, one of the things this comes back to our IP and product development is, we have a nascent platform called Nucleus for Healthcare, which is quite frankly evolving rapidly. But what it does is it brings together those data engineers, those business specialists, those portfolio consultants, those application developers, those infrastructure experts, all together to actually coherently deliver provider modernization, whether that means reconciling 5 different EHR systems into a centralized source, whether that means reducing the time to claims processing, whether that means a better patient or provider care experience. All of those things we're sort of reconciling with this blended approach to teaming. And so that is one example that, I guess I'll keep it unnamed, but that is one example that comes to mind right off the bat.
Just kind of digging into that, like when you're in that actual facility and you're putting together this like modernization team of all of like SMEs from your ecosystem, what percentage of that team are people from the hospital or the local business that you're actually doing work for?
That's a great question. I would say that typically, when you're talking about business SMEs coming from the client environment, they're really trying to minimize how many resources they allocate to a particular project because they have a million other things to do. You're probably just one of the service providers that they're managing. So their time is usually quite limited. I would say they represent 10 to maybe top 20% of the overall team effort for that kind of integration or modernization effort. So that's really roughly ballparking. Of course, it depends on the level of engagement we have with a particular client, what their priorities are, if they're more handcuffed on the business process workflow side of the house, or if they're more handcuffed on the data integration and delivering web portals and patient experiences side of the house. So it really does vary case by case, but that's probably roughly how I would ballpark it.
So I think I'll tell a little bit of a different client story. For me, a great example of how we engage that way overall is when we're really talking about not just delivering services, but working on enculturation of some of those processes. So you mentioned we've really pivoted over the last few years to sort of a team-based, pod-based approach. There's a financial services company where we've introduced a large number of delivery pods, and those are partly staffed by client SME resources. There are also pods that are fully functioning that are completely client-side resources. And we've overlaid that with business consulting and sort of organizational change management and agile coaching. Okay. So we've, the focus of that is to deliver the goods, deliver the project, right? Provide the services, but to do it in a way that allows us to act as an exemplar and really build that culture for the client so they can take that forward on their own. They can take that forward with other providers if they choose to, or they can stay with us and try to really build that culture and make it deeper. And I think that's a really ideal example for us of how we would engage as a GSI as well.
Brent, is these couple of stories here that I put the guys on the spot for, is this align with what you're seeing other GSIs do in the market? and how does it, and maybe how is it different?
I mean, in the sense that it's aligning, I think this is what businesses are demanding, right? So like GSIs that don't operate in this model are adjusting themselves. Otherwise, they are kind of moving down with regards to priority as a vendor. I think what you're talking about is managing the difference between being a vendor and a partner.
Yes.
And you want to stay in that partner realm, that position of trust where the product you're delivering is the relationship you have with the business, not just the outcome of whatever project you've been contracted to deliver. And I think kind of keeping the relationship as the focus there and making sure that you have your customer's best interests in mind and you're adjusting and you're shifting on the fly is important. I think one of those things is, you talked a little bit about industry focus and being able to develop vertical specific knowledge. I think that ends up kind of transitioning into how to communicate the outcomes of your transition according to whatever narrative, a healthcare institution needs or a financial services institution needs. Like how do you measure that relationship? How do you measure the value of what you're delivering to that client? I think it ends up being very particular to both their industry and their specific business.
Maybe on that note a bit, Brent, like what role do you see consulting play, probably particularly in this very domain/industry specific deal? What role do you see consulting play in really helping organizations understand what it looks like for them to be future fit, for lack of a better term?
I think consulting companies bring in a wealth of knowledge about other institutions in the same vertical or the same industry, so that companies can start to figure out like what is good. A lot of times, like when you're in your own business, it's hard for you to figure out like what is good. Or you might see something that a differentiated like competitor is doing, like how did they get there? And they just don't have like the scope of experience to be able to figure out like how do you get from A to B. And I think that's one of the values that a good consulting partner or GSI brings to the table, along with like that, ecosystem of capability and, a good like framework for how do you iterate through this project. And kind of being able to tell the business in the terms that they understand what that transition is going to look like, why they need to change, what change will look like, and what are all the steps in between. And what do we do if we get off track? What happens if in the middle of this project we go through a major recession? How do we adjust? Do we adjust? And give people kind of a view of what the future is going to look like for them.
We've certainly covered a lot of ground today, from describing the modernized state, how these mainframe modernization buyers are actually buying, and who those coalitions might even be. We touched on various approaches and growth mindsets to mainframe modernization, and we even touched on what success can look like with the right trusted partner. So I'd really like to thank immensely all three of you, Glenn, Imran, Brent. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you all for joining us for coffee and conversation. I want to make sure that everybody checks out our website and our socials for highlights from this long form piece, and reach out to us with questions. We'd love to get wired with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye all.